My job is to manage the fisheries on Minnesota's portion of Lake Superior. And every once in a while I get a chance to give a talk to teachers, which is really fun for me because I've had a great time doing that. The best workshop I did is we were able to go out to Isle Royale with a whole group of teachers. I don't know if that was a Sea Grant project or not, Cindy. It was a long time ago. Yeah, and it was good. We got to go out there. I ended up rooming with this guy. He was an old guy, my age now, but you know, back then he was an old guy. And he actually started with sea lamprey control on the Great Lakes, knew a bunch of the people that are in a lot of the publications, drank some really good rum, and then about 2 o'clock in the morning he was out on the porch of our room doing the moose calls, and they were actually calling back. So that's my kind of a perception of what you teachers get into. So probably not always like that. So anyway, I've been on Lake Superior now for about 23 years. I started out with the DNR in the Fergus Falls area. I grew up in Fargo-Moorhead, so that was kind of close to home. And then moved to and became the supervisor of the Alexandria area. There's 4 counties there right around Alexandria that's mostly working with walleyes and bass and that sort of thing. But I had done my master's degree at the university on smelt in Lake Superior, and I always wanted to kind of get a chance to get back up here. And these jobs open up very often. I've been here for 23 years, so if somebody wants my job, they might have to wait a few more years anyway. It was just the right time for me to move, and the job came open, so I took it, and I've really enjoyed it ever since. What I wanted to talk about today, and what Nadine asked me to talk about at first was, well, what did the floods do as far as fish populations go? How did it affect the fish populations in the lake and in the streams? And I told her, geez, you know, we don't really know how that's happened yet. We haven't had a chance to measure all that. It's kind of early. I mean, obviously we can see some major changes in river systems and stuff. As far as the lake goes, you know, it's kind of anybody's guess. But what I thought I would do is start out, you know, with that in mind, start out with just some general background of the things that I work on, that I'm very familiar with, and then transition in to talk about the flood a little bit. It sounds like you've had some great slides already. I've got a few of those, but not a whole lot. And then talk about food webs and how it maybe has affected food webs that you just were dealing with. And it's interesting to look at the food web business. I mean, that's something in Lake Superior that we've spent an awful lot of time looking at. It's kind of a new area. I shouldn't say a new area of science. We've spent probably the last 10 or 12 years looking at food webs. We've always known they're there, but we've been so busy studying the individual species, trying to understand them, but we haven't connected the web yet. And there's a lot of people that spend their entire career on one of those pathways, let's say from mysis to Cisco, and that's all they've studied. And they look at the rate of consumption, and they look at how that energy flows. And there's lots of models out there now that folks have been working on. And each one of us as professionals in the group kind of tends to plug into where their expertise is. So, you know, we could spend all day, a couple days, and in fact there's entire conferences on food webs. But what I'm going to do is try to give you just a brief overview of some of the work that I do in Lake Superior, and then talk about a little bit again about the flood. So I've titled this talk, and I robbed some of this from other presentations I give, but it's the status of the Lake Superior fishery in Minnesota. I've called it Where the Rubber Meets the Road, because it's really the management, the stuff we do. You can do all the science and stuff, but we're kind of where that really happens, and it can get pretty tense at times because there's a lot of constituent groups that want us to do things their way, and everybody's got a different idea of how it should be done. And for this talk, I talked about and where the flood washes away the road, because we've all seen that over the last summer. So the outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lake Superior fishery, the ecological properties of the lake, and why it produces the type of fishery it does, why it's not Lake Michigan, why it's not Lake Erie. Talk a little bit about some of the status and the changes in the Lake Superior fish community that has been going on for the last 20 or 30 years. Talk just real briefly about some future threats and concerns, and then, like I said, talk about the flood and then the potential effects on food webs. So Lake Superior, I'm sure everybody in this room knows, it's big. It's the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, so it's a pretty special lake to be working on. It's also extremely deep. The dark blue area is the area of the lake that's deeper than 240 feet or 80 meters. And when we talk about and we think about Lake Superior as far as the fishery goes, as far as the tourists go, kayakers, swimmers, most of us look at the light blue area and that's what we think about as Lake Superior. Unless you're a cross lake sailor or on a freighter, you probably never get exposed to the really dark blue area, which is over 80% of the lake. So it's a big part of it. It's very deep. It has a fairly different fish community than we're used to looking at. It's a very simple one. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's big and it's deep. It's also very cold. Yes?
I have a question about the 240 feet. Is there a reason why it's 240 feet?
Yeah, that's a good question. Within the fisheries community, we talk about in Lake Superior a nearshore fish community and an offshore fish community. In the nearshore fish community, like I mentioned, is the light blue area, and that's where you see things like the lean lake trout. A lot of the productivity is in that area, the major amount of productivity, which would be things like rainbow smelt, which is a non-native. Some of the fishes that we would consider cool water fishes, walleye, sturgeon, those types of fish are mostly in that area. What inhabits this deep zone is very simple. It's the fat lake trout or the Siskoet lake trout, the bloater or kai, and then the burbot. And so those are the main species that you find out in that area. And I'll talk about those in a little bit as well. So it's big and it's deep and it's very cold. You can see here that the temperature, the light green, as you see in Lake Superior, some of a little bit in Lake Michigan, but this is taken in October, the middle of October, when really the water temps in Lake Superior are about the warmest. Has all summer to create that heat. But if you look at the three lakes here in Michigan, Huron, and Ontario, those are kind of lighter brown and yellow, so they're in about the 60-degree range. Lake Superior, 50-degree range, and then in Lake Erie, the shallowest lake, is in the 60 and plus range. So it's very cold, and it has a lot to do with what it can produce. One of the things that we see in Lake Superior is when it warms, and this happens to be in June, which is really getting it to be summer in most areas, but around here it's still very much spring. The dark red areas are where the water warms the most, and those are really kind of the really productive areas for creating and producing fish. Larval fish hang out in those areas. The three bays up in Ontario, Nipigon, Black Bay, and Thunder Bay, and then the western arm right here where we're at, Chequamegon Bay in Wisconsin, Keweenaw Bay, and then the south shore around Marquette a little bit. So those are very critical areas for fish production. This small graph here just shows the preferred temperatures and available temperatures of various fish species that we find in Lake Superior. The dark band here is the winter temperatures, roughly 0 to 5 degrees Celsius, and then 5 to about 12 or maybe this summer 15 degrees in the summer. And one of the things that you'll see right away is that lake trout and lake herring or cisco and burbot all fall within that range, and they fall within there most of the year. Those fish are all native fish. They have evolved here, and they seem to be very well suited to these temperatures. Rainbow smelt, steelhead, coho, and Chinook salmon are all non-native species. They've been introduced or have been accidentally introduced or intentionally introduced into the system. And they really struggle at times when the water temperatures are very low. So steelhead, Chinook salmon, coho salmon, very much on the margin thermally of their range. So rainbow smelt also, you know, it's very much a nearshore species. It doesn't utilize the entire lake like we see some of the more native species utilizing. So it's big, you know, it's cold, and it's deep, and that really dictates the type of fish community that we have out here. And the question I probably get more than anything is, why can't Lake Superior be like Lake Michigan or Lake Huron, where they produce very large salmon, very big fish? And it's because of the conditions of the lake. It's the same reason we can't grow cotton in Duluth. It doesn't work very well because of the climate we have. And it's the same with the lake. This is a food web, of course, and I thought I'd talk about the fish community. I'll talk about, you guys talked about this area, the primary production, secondary production already. I'm going to concentrate on the forage fish or the prey fish, the predator fish, and then a little bit about humans, which is probably the toughest part of the food chain as far as management goes, dealing with the human. I'll start with the prey species. There's 4 major pelagic prey species. When I talk about pelagic, that would just be the open water areas of the lake. There's Cisco or lake herring that you were dealing with in the other room. There's rainbow smelt, which is the introduced species, and then there's 2 younger or smaller cousins of the Cisco, and that's Kai and bloater. And they're kind of interesting because they inhabit in the lake. Lake Superior is so big that the habitat can change in depth. So the lake herring or Cisco are more in the upper surfaces of the lake. The Kai is in the midwater areas, probably between 100 feet below the surface and 300 feet in depth. And then the very deep areas are where the bloater hang out. So, you know, we see these fish, they're very plastic as far as species go. A lot of times you'll see all sorts of things that look like a Cisco, and it has Kai characteristics. They interbreed a lot, but they're in these areas, and they've adapted to these areas with physiological and morphological changes that help them feed. So, I mean, we could talk all day about that too, but it's an interesting family to work with. I'm mostly going to talk as far as management goes with both rainbow smelt and lake herring. As I mentioned, rainbow smelt, which is the yellow line here, is an introduced species. And if you've been around Duluth very long, you know, you probably remember some of the big party days when the smelt would run and all the people would come from, all over the Midwest to go smelting. And it was really a circus atmosphere. And you know, I think some people enjoyed it, but a lot of people didn't, probably the residents here. But it was really, if you look at it, it's just a short period of time on the chart here. And what this really shows is the historical catch or harvest of Cisco, which is the red line, and rainbow smelt in the commercial fishery. And so you can see that the smelt gradually increased from till the mid-70s and then had a precipitous drop. Lake herring, on the other hand, have been around for a long time, or Cisco. There was a lot of harvests that occurred in the 30s and 40s, and then they started to fall off. And there's a lot of folks that attribute that to overfishing. At one time, there were 400 fishermen along the Minnesota shore from Duluth up to the Canadian border. So that's, I mean, if you looked at it by miles, that would be almost 4 fishermen every mile. And they harvested a lot of fish. When the smelt came in, it probably acted as competition as well and really drove lake herring numbers down. But I just like to show this because I think it's interesting when people think about smelt, you know, within your lifetime, gee, that's what's always been there, but it's really just been a very short period of time. This is just this is just the smelt graph in a little more detail. You can see the huge drop in the late 1970s. And that was really caused by predation, again, the food web effect, predation by predator fish that got reestablished. and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But smelt are probably at about 5% of their level, 5% of their level from where they were before. Oh, CPUE, sorry. That's catch per unit of effort. It's kind of an index of abundance. So in this case, it's the amount of fish caught in one net lift. I'll also talk about it with gill nets, and gill nets are a line of nets, and it's measured in length in feet. So it would be, let's say, 10 fish per 1,000 feet of net. Gives you some idea of how abundant the fish are in the lake, but it's just an index. And then the other thing I'll talk about was CPUE, catch per unit effort, would be in an angling fishery, where it's the number of fish caught per hour's fish. And it's, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. It's some jargon that we use all the time. And so I will talk about that as we go through a number of these slides here. So what we've seen is the smelt population has really come down and has stayed down for a long period of time. They're still abundant. I mean, they're still out there, but you don't see any of the big smelt runs like you saw in the 70s and 60s. So the Cisco, which was formerly known as lake herring, unfortunately, the scientific community decided it was not really like a herring in the ocean, so they decided to call it Cisco. We were talking about common names. In Minnesota, the whole group of these small silverfish, the Coragonid group, is called Cisco by the commercial fishermen. If you go into a smoked fish store, you'll get smoked Cisco, which are usually bloater, so it's really kind of screwed up a lot of our nomenclature. So I use it interchangeably depending on the audience I'm talking to, and a lot of times I get it mixed up and use it in different areas. Year class strength of Cisco, and a year class strength is just the number of fish that are born and survive in a given year. Like, all your fourth graders would be a year class, and all your fifth graders would be a different year class. So what we saw with Cisco is that their numbers really driven down to very low abundance based on overfishing, we think, and probably competition with smelt at all as well. And what the agencies did that managed them is they discontinued fishing. They did not allow fishing in Minnesota in the month of November, which is their spawning season. So these fish get together, they congregate, they spawn. They're extremely vulnerable to netting, commercial netting. And so we discontinued that in the early 1970s to protect the stocks. And then luckily it gave rise to a very strong year class in '84. Back-to-back year classes from '87 to '91. And since that time, we can see we've got a strong year class in '98, one in 2003. These fish can live about 20 years, but most of the time they reach sexual maturity and harvest levels at ages 3 to 4. So right now, we're mostly fishing on this 2003 and a little bit on the 2005 year classes. Most of these early year classes have already gone through the system. And again, this is a similar type of graph I showed for smelt. Catch per unit of effort. This is number of fish per length of net per 1,000 feet, and the total harvest on the left. So the '84 year class gave rise here to a very abundant Cisco population. And then the 3-year classes back to '89 and '90. And then 2003. So you can see that in the harvest from the commercial fishery. And because those numbers increased, the fishermen really were excited about the herring or Cisco are back. We want to fish in November again. And the reason they want to fish in November on these spawning stocks is because of this roe fishery. They not only harvest the fish for flesh, but they harvest them for eggs. And that eggs are then processed and sent to the Scandinavian countries and used as caviar. So they usually get about 50 cents a pound for the fish in the round or in flesh, and the caviar they now are getting about $8 a pound for. So they can make a lot of money in a fairly short period of time. Cisco's also come back on the menu a lot on the tourist areas along the shore in the summer. So it's become a very important fishery for the commercial fisheries, but it still sustains all the predators. So we talked about food webs, and so you've got the commercial fishery wanting to harvest a portion, you've got the predator fish wanting to eat a portion, and then obviously you have to leave some for reproduction. So when the commercial folks started asking for more harvest and we started to see the Cisco come back, one of the things we were able to do is use some new technology called hydroacoustics, which is a method of sampling where we can send sound down. It's like a sophisticated fish finder from a vessel, and that sound waves bounce off the fish, it bounces off their swim bladder and sends a signal back to the transducer. A computer then integrates that, and we can determine the abundance of fish out there and the weight or biomass. And based on individual targets, we can also estimate the size of the fish. What we can't do is determine what species it is. So along with the acoustic work, we also need to pull a midwater trawl through there to catch these targets. And this is a echogram, an acoustic picture of a trawl going through a school of fish here. So that's what you end up with when you pull your trawl sample, is a bunch of different species, types of fish. And again, we talked about Cisco, we talked about kai, we talked about bloater and smelt. And based on then the proportion in the trawl, we apportion that out to what the acoustic estimate is, and then we can estimate basically the biomass of that species of fish in the portion of the lake that we're doing these surveys. And we've been doing these now in Minnesota since 2003. In fact, I just have to digress a little bit. Today at our shop, we've got people there that flew in from Hawaii, from California, and from Washington, the state of Washington, and what they have is not a vessel, but they have a portable, it's a robot basically, and it's not run on batteries or anything, it's run on the waves. So the waves go up and down, it propels this about the size of a large surfboard through the water, and it pulls a towfish that has some of this acoustic gear in it. And we're going up to Grand Marais tomorrow to check it out. They were in Hawaii 2 weeks ago, and now they want to see how it works in a cold environment. So they've come here, and it's pretty exciting to be able to work with them on that. We're not going to be able to do the trawling with this, but we've got a pretty good idea now what the target strength and how that shakes out. The reason we do all this is because once we know how big the Cisco pie is, we can then divide it up, and we've worked with the commercial guys, and they've agreed to take only 10% of the spawning stock biomass for their harvest. So that way we're leaving 90% of the fish in the lake to either feed predators or reproduce on their own. So we've kind of come to this agreement. Seems to be working out pretty well. They're able to harvest their fish in the fall again, so we have opened it up, but they have to adhere to the quota. So if the population goes down, their quota goes down. So just real briefly, to summarize, the smelt have declined while Cisco's increased. The predator consumption controls the forage mix, again, part of that food chain. We have a stable commercial fishery for Cisco now. The smelt fishery is essentially gone. We've implemented these acoustic surveys, and I saw a term in your handout here, but we are likely very near or at carrying capacity for predators in Lake Superior based on the forage we have out there. Unless we see big changes in productivity, and again, the people that study these food webs, we probably are at the point where we cannot produce any more predators. The mix could change again. You know, we could have issues or changes with exotics that could drive different fish up and different fish down, but right now, as far as the overall carrying capacity goes, we think we're pretty close. Yes?
You might be getting into this later, but lake temperature warming, you know, the picture that you showed where all the warm areas are where the fish are breeding, you know, one of the things that I'm always thinking, I'm mulling over with Lake Superior and warming water temperatures is that everything's adapted to the cold. And so, to me, if it's getting warmer like we're looking at bad situations for fish, but then I was thinking about, well, you've got maybe they'd be able to breed more if we had more warm and water temperatures. So could that potentially change the predator carrying capacity?
It could, yeah. So unless, that's a good point. With, say we have increased global warming, the water warms up, and it has been warming up in Lake Superior. You know, I think there's always going to be a pretty large refuge, I should say always, but for our lifetimes, a very large refuge of cold water. But what I tell people is that if you look at Lake Huron or Lake Michigan, we could easily be getting more similar to the regimes that they have, the temperature regimes. So you've got the global warming. The other thing I'll talk about is with the floods, you've got these catastrophic events that are starting to take place. And you know, we saw a huge amount of sediment go into the lake, and with that sediment, lots of nutrients, and you know, that all has to be assimilated eventually. So you're right, you know, we're at carrying capacity, or we think we're at carrying capacity now, but that doesn't mean that can't change. And it likely will, in you know, one way or the other. So that's a good question. I'll get to some of that as I go a little further here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about predators. This is the Siskiwet lake trout, or the fat lake trout. You can see where it got its name. But there's probably 10 Siskiwet for every lean lake trout in Lake Superior. And most people don't even know they exist, but they're by far the highest biomass of any predator out there. The lean lake trout is what Lake Superior is known for, and that's what I'll talk about. And then the humper, we don't have too many in Minnesota, but if you go into the Michigan, Wisconsin, not so much Wisconsin, but Ontario waters, there's deep water with large humps and kind of underwater mountains coming up, and that's where you see humpers, is in those areas. It's probably more of a hybrid between these two types. In Minnesota, we've got 3 areas. Yes.
So those 3, are they actually genetically?
Yeah, they're different. They've done a lot of genetics on them, and they've done morphometric measurements, and so they recognize them as different strains. So we've got 3 management zones in Minnesota, MN1, 2, and 3, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. And then in Wisconsin, there's 2. I'd just like to point out here, just because I think it's interesting, is that Minnesota only has 7% of the total Lake Superior area, and Wisconsin only has 6%. So we've got about 15% just in this small corner, and the rest is split pretty evenly between Ontario and Michigan. So we're relatively small players when it comes to Lake Superior. And people always tease me, they say, well, you only have 1 lake to manage. I say, no, I don't. I only have 7% of 1 lake. But it's still more surface area than all the water in Minnesota combined. So, you know, we got a little bit on it there. So you can't really talk about lake trout without talking a bit about sea lamprey. And probably most people here, hopefully, have a feel for the sea lamprey story. But I'll very briefly go through the sea lamprey story, in that when they dug a channel around Niagara Falls in the late 1800s to increase shipping commerce. When they did that, it allowed sea lamprey to get into the upper Great Lakes. And so from about the late 1800s to about 1950, sea lamprey pretty much decimated lake trout stocks throughout all the Great Lakes, and only in Lake Superior there were a few remnant native stocks left. So it's really a critical animal as far as being a real top predator, and it's also an exotic. So as far as food webs go, somebody was saying, well, exotics, how could that disrupt a food web? Well, here's a great example of an exotic that disrupted a food web by wiping out the top predator. They're still trying to reestablish lake trout in the lower lakes. Luckily here in Lake Superior, we are pretty lucky in that we had some remnant stocks. The other thing they were able to do is they formed a Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and part of their responsibility was to try to control sea lamprey. And they were able to, in the early 1960s, to come up with a very specific chemical that killed sea lamprey. in the stream. Sea lamprey are an interesting animal in that they're much like salmon, where the adults go into streams to spawn, and the larvae live in these streams. They burrow in sediment for anywhere from 3 to 15 years before they metamorphosize, they call it, and then migrate out to the lake and become predators. When they're stream, they're filter feeders. They filter this detritus and bacteria, just junk that's flowing down the stream. And then when they metamorphosize, of course, they're looking for hosts out there, and lake trout is one of their favorite hosts. This happens to be the number of wounds for one. This is kind of how we measure the effect on lake trout of sea lamprey. Yeah.
So the chemical, did that work? Or did it not work?
Yeah, it did work. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's called TFM. It was very specific for sea lamprey, and they were able to reduce the numbers by about 90–95%. It's just a control. It will never, the chemical itself will never really wipe them out. We're never going to eradicate them, but they're certainly under control. We spend probably $25 to $30 million a year throughout the Great Lakes treating streams with TFM. There's I mean, I could spend all day on that too, but there's a number of other methods to control sea lamprey as well. There's some experimental methods out there, but this is the one that's really done the majority of the work. We were lucky because we had remnant stocks in Lake Superior. They started treatments here, and you can see the wounding has gone from, it was actually higher than 30 and 40, but is down now to about 5 to 10 wounds per lake trout that we see. Despite the reduction in sea lamprey, the pink area here is the amount of mortality on lake trout from sea lamprey. So the red area is fishing mortality, the pink area is lamprey mortality, and then the dark area is just natural mortality. We talk about mortality, it's how many of those fish are dying and what from. And as a manager, we set that bar at a certain level, and we don't want to see more fish dying than what our criteria calls for, or they won't be able to reproduce themselves. So in Lake Superior, we've got about a 40% mortality rate. And in MN1, this small zone between Duluth and Two Harbors, that's where most of our fishing occurs, about 85%. So in that zone, fishing's taking about as much as sea lamprey, but if you go up to the central area or up in MN3, most of the lake trout that are dying either of natural causes or of sea lamprey. So it's still a very major factor in mortality of lake trout. Despite that, again, now this is catch per unit of effort in an angling fishery, so number of fish caught per hour, and your success rate has increased if you're an angler, hugely since 1990. The total number of fish harvested has increased, so things are really looking good. And the best part of this, at least from my perspective, is that these are pretty much all wild fish now. They're not from a hatchery, they're not stocked. They've all reproduced, most of them on their own. We're approaching 90%. Up in the northern zone, it's well over 90%. In the central zone, it's about 90%. We're still at about 80% in this MN1 zone. So that's good news. So like I just mentioned, wild fish have increased while the stocked fish have declined. We've actually discontinued stocking in the most northern zone and the central zones. The only place we stock now is right in the Duluth area, and my guess is that we're reaching the criteria where we would discontinue stocking there as well. We just don't see those fish survive anymore. And we have implemented a limited commercial fishery in MN2 and 3. As you saw, there's a lot of room before we hit a 40% mortality rate, so we were able to do that. And it's we have a successful sport and charter fishery for lake trout now. Most of it naturally reproduced. Just want to briefly talk about Chinook salmon. They were introduced to try to take care of smelt. When the numbers increased, they did a pretty good job of it, along with a rebound in lake trout. That's why we saw smelt decline. At one time, they would reach, I think our state record's about 30 pounds. Right now, we seldom see them over 10 pounds. Again, going back to the food web, are we at carrying capacity? These are the sorts of clues that we get from the fish community to tell us we are. The other thing with Chinook salmon, although we stocked them, we thought, well, once a lake trout rebound, we can discontinue stocking and they'll just go away. Well, we're pretty lucky in Lake Superior that we have a good habitat available. These guys all reproduce on their own now. We've discontinued stocking them in Lake Superior, in Minnesota's portion of Lake Superior. Wisconsin's discontinued stocking them. And the last 3 or 4 years, we've had all-time high catches. So it looks really good. If you're a salmon fisherman, they just don't get as big as they used to because we just don't have the prey out there that we once had. Coho salmon, kind of the little brother of the Chinook salmon, they were introduced as well early on. And the anglers wanted to stock Chinook salmon instead, so we switched to Chinook salmon. And we thought, well, when we discontinued coho stocking, they'd go away. Well, they're the second most caught fish in the lake now, and none of the agencies in Lake Superior stock them. So they're all from wild reproduction as well. Little steelhead kamloop. These are large rainbow trout. They ascend the rivers in the spring to spawn. People get real excited about them. They're very passionate. And I think one of the reasons it's very popular is because it's really one of the first fishery that opens up in the spring. There's 2 strains here. This is a steelhead, this is a kamloop. The steelhead numbers dropped very low for a while, and so we introduced a regulation where you could not harvest a steelhead. You could catch them, catch and release, you couldn't keep one. We also stock, this is a hatchery strain of kamloop that we stock, and it's called the Put, Grow, and Take program. So we put them in, they grow for 3 years, and then you can harvest them. And you can harvest 3 kamloop, they're over 16 inches. And again, you know, we put them in fairly small, and a lot of these fish are between 4 and 10 pounds when anglers catch them. So it's a pretty good program, people enjoy it. Again, very passionate about it. Yes?
Could you tell people roughly what it costs for each family?
If you're not stocking steelhead, it doesn't cost anything because if they reproduce on their own. We've had a lot of demand for stocking them from a hatchery. We're not really excited about that, but sometimes you get forced to do some things in fisheries management. And so we did 4 years of, actually 8 years of stocking steelhead yearlings, and it depends on the time series that you're looking at, but the cost of return per angler was anywhere from $650 at the high end down to about $300. So per fish caught by an angler. So it's a pretty expensive program. The kamloops, they're not cheap either, but you know, the fishery does bring in money into the economy and to the shore. But the kamloops, because they're cheaper to rear and the return rate is higher at around 20. It's always interesting to me that some of these anglers are pretty passionate and they get all fired up and they say, you know, Don, we're not getting our money's worth. You're not doing a very good job, and all I've caught is only 3 steelhead. And it's like, 3 steelhead, that's like $2,000. Let's say you paid $17 for your license. I think you're getting your money's worth, you know. So it's an interesting perspective. You know, it's good to apply some economics to these because you know, it's a currency that people think about. Just real quickly, the harvest rate, again, catch per effort. The red line is lake trout, the yellow line is all salmonids, so the difference there is the salmon catch. And I guess what I wanted to point out here is this: about 80% of the fish caught in the angling fishery in the summer creel survey are from lake trout. So it's really a lake trout lake. That's the bread and butter, and it's a very active, successful fishery. I wanted to talk a little bit about some exotics that have entered the system. Zebra mussel, you've all heard about, probably round goby and rough, and they're all right out the window here. I mean, the St. Louis Harbor has plenty of each one of those species. We've been really lucky in Lake Superior. probably because of the ecological conditions I talked about to begin with, and a lot of calcium level. Proper. We don't see much for round gilby. We don't see much for rough, but those warm areas that I showed, those embayments and those areas, that's where we tend to see some of the exotics. So your question about what will global climate change do, probably make things a little easier for some of these exotics. So I talked about sea lamprey as a threat. The threat there is really just keeping enough money to treat sea lamprey. People tend to forget about it because it's been a very successful program. Disease, we just had VHS, was a very noteworthy disease here in the Great Lakes about 3 years ago. Luckily, it hasn't expanded from where we first saw it, but we're very concerned about diseases, fish disease. Habitat degradation in watersheds. I'll be talking about that a little bit with the floods. Not only the floods, it's the talk about global climate change. Certainly that has lots of long-term implications, along with some of the catastrophic events we just another thing, sea lamprey control, atmospheric deposition and contaminants. We kind of forget about them because, they've been around a long time. The levels are suppressed. It's good, but they're still there, and there's always new ones on the scene. So in summary, for the fisheries part here, really in pretty good condition. Temperature and depth really drive what the species diversity and abundance is. And habitat degradation is probably one of the biggest issues we have near shore in the watersheds and tributaries. If you want to read about this stuff in more detail, there are management plans out there. Get on the DNR website and you can find all sorts of stuff if you're more interested in the details. Need to move along a little bit, but I just wanted to talk a bit about the flood. You've probably seen some of these shots already. This is the Thompson Dam in the St. Louis River, Highway 210 that it cut through. I think the bike trail is still intact.
I ran across the new bridge last night.
All right.
It's not open to cars, but then
oh, you ran
across it.
Okay. Well, and it just shows, how much damage and how much power that the water has. This is, to me, these are trees sitting in the river here. This is fairly unbelievable to me. This again is the St. Louis River. I know I saw somebody's from Jay Cook here. This is the swinging bridge, or what's left of the swinging bridge. I think a day or so after the flood. Notice how brown the water is, how much debris is in there. This is, I think it's called Forebay Lake, which is in Jay Cook, or right along Jay Cook State Park. And it was a hydropower development. I think that there's a generator on the downstream end. And what it did is it breached the levee and it cut through the woods and reconnected with the St. Louis River.
I teach in Carlton, so.
Just a bike trail here, right?
Yeah, but the other side there, you go out, when you couldn't go out there for a $500 fine, but I found Sunday morning, there's no law enforcement around.
What's your name?
You see the river that goes through the bottom, the middle there? That is actually cut out of the bottom of the lake. And where it broke through there, it's a whole new river.
Yeah.
It carved a whole new river through the woods.
Yeah, this is the channel now.
Yeah, that's all brand new. That wasn't there.
And what Matt's pointed out is what I wanted to talk about a little bit is all that erosion, all that sediment that came out of there. And that's just one spot that's very visible. That's been going watershed.
It's 20 feet deep.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. If you've been out there, it's certainly worth the trip. This has two messages. One is, of course, is how brown the water is and all the sedimentation. But this is a lake sturgeon. And about a week or two after the floods, we started getting calls about fish were stranded. Lake sturgeon are obviously a fairly large fish. We were able to go and rescue quite a few of them, but I'm sure that there was a lot of fish that got stranded in high water. The water dropped, they didn't move. So there's a pretty immediate effect of fish on flood. what kind of a normal stream looks like along the North Shore, you know, fairly typical of what we used to have. Now they look more like this, you know, with all the woody debris, a lot of rubble built up. You know, all the shade is gone. You know, you've got, you know, not really a well-defined channel. One of the really big concerns I have is since the flood, we really haven't had much rain. It's done, the flood scoured out some really deep holes, which is good because we were lacking deep water habitat. But it pushed it all up just downstream, and there's still many streams where there's no longer connectivity, where fish can move from one pool to the other. There's water going through and it's filtering through some of this rock rubble area, but until we get a decent flow, and it's probably not going to come till runoff now, those pools aren't going to get connected. Oops. This happens to be the Knife River. This is the 4-lane as you're going towards Two Harbors. You can see how much erosion came out of that area, how much woody debris is sitting down in there. I mean, this all adds up, all this erosion. This happens to be, again, this is just a small road, but there's thousands of these things within the watershed. And, you know, again, the bank, this doesn't look nearly as impressive as some of the areas, but just think of this over and over and over. It all adds up. A lot of expense. This happens to be a fish trap that we have on Knife River. This is just downstream of the 4-lane, which is right here. And the fish come up. This is mostly targeted at steelhead. The fish swim up this side. There's a trap here, so we can count and monitor and handle all the adults that go up. And on this side, this is a smolt trap, and we can catch all the small fish that come down. So it's really a nice management tool for us. And notice where the pickup is, what it looked like after the flood, and pretty much still looks like that. But the pickup was parked here. You know, this was all filled into here. Obviously, there were no trees on it. You know, this is upstream of the gates. Those were all demolished. So a lot of power going down those streams. This, I mean, some of you have seen this shot. We talked a little bit about the lake, but this is where sediment enters into the lake. I mean, huge plume of sediment. Probably increased the temperature quite a bit during the spring because it was just very brown water. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit as far as food webs go, the flood. This is a very fuzzy picture. Unfortunately, I didn't have all these really nice handouts that Nadine put together before this. I just lifted some of these off the internet that were useful for me. But we talked about photosynthesis, the sun coming through. There's this eutrophic zone. And obviously with that amount of sediment coming in, this eutrophic zone in the western part of the lake was probably right up here on the surface. So I think in the short term, we lost a lot of productivity during the month or so that all that sediment was out there. But I think what we've gained is a lot of sediment coming in that brought a lot of nutrients in. Those are going to end up getting recycled over time. So we could end up actually seeing increased productivity in the food web based on the flood that we just saw. I mean, I don't know how many truckloads of sediment came in, but I'm sure that there's huge amounts. You know, so there's always this balance going on between, you know, how much sunlight, how much nutrients, what's the temperature, and what the total production is. This is a little clearer slide, but it lists the same sorts of trophic levels that you folks were dealing with, in that, you know, we have phytoplankton from the sun, zooplankton that utilize the phytoplankton in the forage fish, and then the adult fish, and then a lot of the sedimentation that's occurring carrying the. Yep.
Could you go back to so Don said eutrophic zone, he meant euphotic zone.
Yo, euphotic, I'm sorry.
Euphotic means lack of light, so the sediment is keeping the water down, means there's no sun for photosynthesis. So just to
Yeah, it's like you pulled the shade on it or something. Yeah. Thanks, Cindy. Cindy's always watching my back. This is just the Lake Superior, very simplified food web. I didn't realize you guys were going to become experts in this, but that's pretty much what you've been working with. And then lastly, and this is a lot better in your folder, but you've got this Lake Superior food web, and I thought it was cool because it's got some really nice photographs of some of the critters that you'll be dealing with, or if you work with your students. And I thought it was pretty impressive to have our own food web poster, and so I think that's cool.
And if you're curious, there is also a food web image for each of the other